listen very quietly, and you'll hear a sound that is almost extinct. Hi, I'm Bill Jones, and I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about me growing up in this community in the 1940s. That sound you just heard was a love that I had for trains and whistles, and that is one of the reasons that I was inspired to recreate from my memory and other materials, this display here. I was always fascinated by steam whistles and log trains and anything that was mechanically moving. The whistles that you heard were instrumental in the lives of everyone just about back in these times. The whistles were blown for people to get up, go to work, stop to break, to eat lunch. For emergencies, there was a lot of reasons. And even train whistles. A lot of the passenger trains that run in those days were right on schedule, and people used those to say, there goes so-and-so, it must be about 10 o'clock. So trains were very prompt. Engineers were very, very particular about having their trains run on schedule. I'd like to start the introduction by bringing in the logs with the log trains from the woods. This is the Alger line that ran into Alabama, where Alger-Sullivan owned about 280,000 acres of land, and it was prime, virgin, longleaf pine, some of the best timber in the South at the time. And their log lines at times extended about 90 miles up into Alabama. These log trains were about 25, 26 cars every day. The train would go out and pick up these cars and bring them in. And I'll walk around here and show you the process of the logs once they got to the mill. During the 1940s was a transition period from log trains to log trucks. Both were being used. Here you'll see a replica of the first log truck that Alger-Sullivan owned. It was about a 1937 Ford. It's loaded with logs here waiting to be unloaded. And the logs were alternately unloaded from the log trains and the trucks. Most of the trucks during the day, the log trains were unloaded late in the evenings and early night. The logs were unloaded into this large pond here that's much, much bigger than the little model will show you. And it extended all the way back up to the L&N Railroad trestle. And incidentally, this is one of my favorite places to fish and to get frogs when I was growing up as a young boy in Century. As the logs were unloaded here, this was basically a storage area that they were held until needed. They would come around and go up this flume into the mill, as you'll see on the conveyor here. They would go into the mill, The mill was a double band saw that had a carriage on this side and a carriage on this side, and the saw had teeth on both sides. It would make a cut going down. The carriage would shift over and come back and make a cut coming this way. And it had a tremendous capacity of over 100,000 feet a day that they cut on one shift. At times, the mill would run extra shifts. Part of the process of making the lumber, you had an awful lot of waste. This conveyor belt here shows the waste going out to the bark burner where it was burned. A lot of people would come and get this residue and use it to cook with as charcoal. This screen here was a protector to keep the sparks from flying back into the mill. One of the hazards of sawmills was that they were always burning down. Also in the process of making the lumber, you had a lot of sawdust. The sawdust would accumulate, go through this conveyor belt over into the fuel house, as well as the sawdust and shaving from the planer mill, which is right here, would come up into this system here and would go into the fuel house. They could keep it separated or they could mix it. It depended on how they wanted to burn the fuel. This was the boiler house right here with the four stacks that you see. They used this residue as a fuel to fire the boilers, which ran the turbines for the electricity that the village used, plus the lights and so forth in the mill. Now, most of the machinery in the mill was operated off of a huge steam-driven engine that was in the machine room underneath the sawmill here. And the statistics on how wide the belt was, the drive belt was like an inch thick of leather, 24 inches wide or so, real wide. It was a huge thing. It was amazing to see it run. I only was able to see it once or twice, and I kind of slipped in because I was just a little boy. And but I was always interested in seeing things operate, but I did get to see that huge machine operate. Then the fuel comes back out and it would be burned. Process of sawing the log. In the process of sawing the logs, this mill, one of their prime products was timbers produced for export shipment. And the timbers would come out, that would be the east end of the mill, come over into this conveyor belt here and go back down into the mill pond, and they would be rafted up here in the rafts, and it was about the south 1/3 of the log pond, much bigger area than this. There would be 30, 40, or 50 of these rafts at the time out in the log pond. All right. Then these timbers would be loaded here with this crane. It was a crane made by the company, and they would be loaded on the flat cars, and that would be look like that as the finished product. They always stamped the word Alger on the side of their cars. You'll see a couple of cars up on the main line L&N that have already been pushed out and ready. Most of this material went to Pensacola. And the reason for this mill being built in Florida was the fact that the timber was all holding for all in Alabama, was the fact that they could get a cheap freight rate. I think it was just a switching charge, which is just a minimal freight cost that cost to move these cars to the port in Pensacola. So a big portion of the product produced here was timbers up to like 24 by 24 and 40 and 50 and 60 foot long. They had the prime timber that this material could be cut out of. So incidentally, my dad's crew, he was an inspector. His crew is the one that loaded these timbers. Also, he loaded some of the lumber off of the yards that went back into the planing mill, which I'll explain a little later. This little building right here was my dad's office. He also had to share it with a tool room. But the lumber portion, or the thin material that was made in the process of making the timbers, it went in two places. It either come out to the yard to air dry, which took 3 or 4 months for it to completely air dry, and the yards were much, much bigger than as indicated here. A lot of the lumber come right directly out of the end of the mill, come around and went into the dry kilns here, and took a 2 or 3 day period, would dry it much faster than the air drying outdoors. And this lumber would then go right directly back into the planer mill to be dressed and cut into molding, 2x4, 2x6s, 1x4s, V-edge paneling, and this type thing. And I'll come around now and show you a little bit about the planer mill operation. The lumber that would, after it was air dried, would be loaded on these little cars here that were made in the machine shop right here, as well as all of the log cars that you see. They had a crew in there that did nothing but make the log carts and kept the maintenance up on those. Really, it took about at least 50 log carts in action at any given time, because you would have 25 loaded in the mill and 25 at the mill being unloaded. So it took at least 50 cars to make the operation successful. Here is a picture of a little loader that's in the shop being repaired, and here is a picture of a little piece of equipment that was used for maintenance and laying of the rails. After the lumber was hauled off of the yard on these cars, it went into the planer mill and was dressed. And in this shed here, you'll see a picture of a little box car back up in the shed. You could probably put 10 or 12 box cars in that shed that they would be loading simultaneously, filling the customer's orders. And this was the dressed lumber that was used. This right here was used extensively back in that period of time for ceilings, for walls, and it was a real popular grade of lumber that was produced. Let me take you now over into the village itself and show you a little bit about some of the things that went on here. Again, this is just an example, a small example of the things that was there. It does by no means depict all of the size and how big the village was, because I've got less than one block right here where there was about 2 full blocks with housing on that side and this side that was part of the company operation, and that did not count homes that was owned by individuals. We'll start right here. This house was known as the Mayo House, was probably one of the first houses in Century, and the house still is standing with the white picket fence, as it was, it always had that white picket fence even back in the 40s. At the time I lived here in the 40s, this was a post office building right here. This was Doc Wiggum's and Ms. Wiggum's home here. Doc was a druggist. Ms. Wiggum was a big supporter and a member of the Audubon Society, and she loved her birds, and she helped the Boy Scouts, including myself, to get the bird watching merit badge. And if she'd see a rare species of bird come to her house, and she knew them all, she would call the school and let us come over to observe that bird. This street, as it existed in that day and time, had 4 big buildings like this. this house, two other houses in here. One of them was the Sam, was the Houston Jones, I believe, and another house. And then the final house on the end building down here was the clubhouse. This is where all the Lions Club, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, and the different various clubs that existed back in that time met. And I was fortunate enough to be a member of the Boy Scouts here, and myself along with a couple of other guys, Cale Stanton and Buddy Williams, we obtained our Eagle Scout Awards while being a member of the troop that, I believe it was Troop 35 that was in Century at the time. All right, this little street right here was a little boulevard, Jefferson Avenue, had the street lights, was paved. That was kind of an unusual feature for a town this small to have paved streets back in the 40s. Most places of this small magnitude, the streets were all gravel or whatnot. But this is the commissary where just about everybody that you could buy them on credit, because they automatically took it out of your paycheck. So they had a credit risk was not a big factor here. But they had a lot of different material here. The boxcar in the back was made by the same crew that I mentioned earlier about making all the cars. In fact, the real car that's a replica of is behind this building and is part of this museum. At the time that I was a junior and senior in high school, I worked here before and after school and on weekends and in the summertime, and that car was used to store a lot of feed and other materials that would come in. Also, prior to that, when the logging operations was being done with log trains, they had a lot of oxen and mules and things, and feed would come in by the carloads here and would be then transported back out with the log trains to the camps and other supplies that would be needed to feed the many people that was involved in the logging operation. This little building here was the office buildings at the time, during this time. In 1948, this post office building was moved over to this building, the old office building, and the office buildings were moved over into this building here, which was an old theater and a place that they had plays and this type thing. All of these facilities were owned and provided by Alger-Sullivan. They made life pretty reasonable for the period of time to be in a little small place like this. We had a hospital, had a place for movies, and it wouldn't be a regular type movie. We all went to Farmington to see the movies, but they had the barbershops, the dentists. One thing that I did not mention was this period of time, the 1940s, was pretty soon after a tremendous fire that took place in 1939 that burned down all of that complex right in there. And there was 2 or 3 buildings right in this area here that also burned down. And all of the big oak trees on Front Street here, the fire killed those. And later they replanted them. They were just small trees in the 1940s when I lived here. But this area was pretty soon after the fire, and the mill was rebuilt and was in full operation. I might call your attention to the fact that during this period of time, we were in the middle of one of the biggest wars that we've ever been involved in, World War II. Although everything just about was rationed, I was a teenager growing up, still living here, it was a good life. I was glad to have been a part of this. Coming on over, there was a street that come down this way, 4th Street, which this building is on. Mr. House's house, which was a real mansion. mention as far as we were concerned. And then there were several big houses down this street here. I might mention, then going back down Front Street here was the hotel. Then there were 7 big houses like that, the next 2 houses there. Incidentally, we lived in that first house past the hotel there. Our neighbors was the Thomases, the Bakers, the Joneses, Sam Hamilton. I'm probably missing some, but there was several families that lived in the big houses. Then there were smaller houses that went on out about 15 or 20 on each side of the street there. Then over on this street, which we call Church Street, there was about 15 or 20 little houses that went up in that direction. All in all, probably there was at least 50 company-owned houses that the employees lived in. And that does not include 25 or so of the houses that we call them the quarters. There was a long string of houses on that side of the log pond, on both sides of the road, and also down in this area here there was a lot of little houses. One thing that really impressed me about Alger-Sullivan, Mr. House, and the management of this little town and this mill was everything was so neatly and articulate, clean, and kept in good state of repair. These little houses had picket fences, were painted, upkept, same as here. At least once a year there was an inspection crew that would go around and check the houses for needed repairs and take care of it. We had running water. We had electricity that was furnished by the mill. There was no such thing as TV. We did have telephones at the time, but we did not have electrical appliances like stoves and so forth. Most of the people had wood burning of stoves and heaters, and they used the refuse from the planing mill as material to fire those with. Getting back over to Church Street, you had 2 churches over there. A Methodist, I believe the first church is a Baptist church, and the next one is a Methodist church. And just up above that, you'll see the L&N Depot. And I'll get back around there and say a little bit about the L&N Railroad in just a moment. But these churches were on this side of the road on Church Street, and then immediately behind that was the hospital or beyond that. And there was a long, long distance between that church and the depot. So don't let that little short distance on the model confuse you there. There was almost a quarter of a mile in there. But I did want to show you the impact of the railroad, because that was one of our prime modes of transportation. Even to go a couple miles to Flomaton, people caught what was called the short. Would catch the train here and ride it to Flomaton, see a movie on Saturday and come back, or hitchhike, or however we could get away. A lot of times we rode our bikes. But everything that you see was just as neatly in place as you see it here. Street lights, flowers, shrubbery. The houses were painted, trimmed very neatly. Now let me come back over in this area and show you a little bit about the L&N part of it. Front view of the houses, the Wiggum House, the Mayo House, and the Clubhouse, as you would see them. Notice the little red building in front of the Wiggum House there. Those were firehouses, hose. I believe the word printed on them was hose house. There was one, I believe, over here on Front Street, and they were scattered throughout the mill, and they had a cart in there with hose on them, and they were for fire protection. The L&N was the line that carried the finished product away from the mill, and as you see, they were coal-fired engines, and here's a couple of cars here that have been loaded. And there was an odd thing about the sign that showed that this facility was Alger-Sullivan Lumber Company. And it was way out here facing the railroad. And the prime reason for that was the people that traveled in that day and time that the Alger-Sullivan people would want to influence wouldn't be riding down the highway in a car or in town in a car. They would probably be coming through Century on a train. And so that was their way of advertisement, was this sign was out facing the L&N Railroad here. This is one of 2 water tanks that was used for fire purposes and drinking water that supplied the water for the village. There's that sound again. You know, if that was a bird or an animal of some kind, it would be on the endangered species. That's a sound that we don't hear too much of anymore. But some few things such as this will maybe preserve it, that we can have look back at some of the fond memories that we had growing up in a community such as this. We hope you've enjoyed going through the details. Thank you.